By nature of this anime taking place before and after an already well-established series, it is literally impossible to do this while trying to avoid all spoilers. So this is your one and only warning. Anything from Danganronpa 1, Danganronpa 2, or Danganronpa Another Episode, from minor details to major plot twists, is fair game for this review. If you would not like to be spoiled and have not played the games, please leave the premises immediately. Here it is at last, the finale to a franchise that I have come to hold quite dear. Danganronpa 1, it's great. Danganronpa 2, even greater. Ultra Despair Girls, mediocre gameplay, but hey, the story's not bad. And Danganronpa 3, well, that's why we're here, aren't we? The animated conclusion to the Hope's Peak Academy saga. I would assume if you are watching this, you are already more than familiar with Danganronpa, so that's enough of the pleasantries, let's get right to it. To begin with, you must know that Danganronpa 3 is split into two, or very technically three, story arcs. The first is Mirai-Han, or the Future arc, which takes place after Danganronpa 2, wherein Makoto Naegi has been accused of treason by the Future Foundation for his actions in protecting the remnants of Despair. However, during his informal trial, things quickly go awry when the forces of Despair move in. The Future Foundation, as well as Makoto and his allies, lose consciousness and wake up to find the building sealed off and odd bracelets strapped to their wrists. Reminiscent of Zero Time Dilemma, these bracelets will inject everybody with an anesthetic at regular intervals. Each time this occurs, the mastermind behind the plan will roam about and kill one of these sleeping defenseless protectors of hope. The final twist, as Monokuma puts it to them, is that this mastermind is one of their own, one of the individuals playing the game. The second story is Zetsubo-Han, or the Despair arc, taking place before even Danganronpa 1, at a point when the world had not yet fallen into despair. This series tells the tale of the 77th class at Hope's Peak Academy, detailing their fall into the depths of despair, as well as the rise of one Junko and Oshima. The third story, although it's really just the last episode, is Kibou-Han, or the Hope arc. Digging too much into what transpires there would ruin the ending of this whole thing, but it is a culmination of the previous two arcs, a closing point with a neatly tied bow. The immediately interesting thing about this anime is that unlike the prior Danganronpa anime, it is not an adaptation. Rather, it is an original story designed specifically to wrap up everything that Danganronpa had built up to this point, and ship off the series with a nice whole ending in such a way that just another game simply would not allow. And if nothing else, it is an ending. It is a full, actual ending to what has at this point become quite the convoluted tale. There are no more real questions left to answer or dangling plot threads mocking you with their lack of resolution. No, this is the end of Danganronpa, or rather, as it is subtitled, the end of Hope's Peak Academy, as the series will reboot itself with a new game hitting Japan this year, although the exact nature of that reboot is dubious. But I digress. Back to Danganronpa 3. The show gives you complete answers. Whether or not you like those answers is another story entirely, but it cannot be denied that everything is answered. Want to know what happens to all the old cast after Danganronpa 2? Answered. Want to know exactly what the deal was with that failed rescue mission during Danganronpa 1? Answered. Want to know what led to the biggest, most awful, most tragic event in human history? Answered. They pull literally everything together, every possible loose end, very much including another episode, so those of you that thought the spin-off would be irrelevant are sadly mistaken. But the real nice thing about being not an adaptation is that the show is given so much more freedom to just be a show without being bogged down by incomplete exposition or shoehorned in video game elements. The world is your oyster without source material, and they took this to heart. Even the character designs have been altered ever so slightly from the original anime. It's less faithful to the game style, sure, but it looks much better in motion. Not only that, there's an incredibly interesting interplay between the Future and Despair arcs, the likes of which I can't remember ever seeing before. Something will happen in the future that will play off something in the past that will set up something else in the future which will itself make something in the past even more tragic, and so on. I feel bad for the people that will come to this series after the fact and think, well, I'll watch one and then the other because that's just not how it was designed. The only way to watch this show is in order of broadcast. Episode 1 of Future, Episode 1 of Despair, Episode 2 of Future, Episode 2 of Despair, etc., until Episode 11 of Despair, Episode 12 of Future, then capping everything off with Hope. This is not at all two separate stories, it is a single massive one, as well as one with plenty of new characters. I won't bother going over the returning cast in any capacity because they're all exactly as you remember. Makoto is the naive optimist, Kirigiri the reserved detective, all the Despair arc characters exactly as they were in Danganronpa 2, for better or worse, but that doesn't mean the new characters get to sit back and slack off. A couple do die before being given much screen time, but that's always the rub with a death game format. Whoever dies early on is almost assuredly gonna be a weaker character just by virtue of having that much less screen time. That's how it works. By far the strongest of these new original characters are Chisayuki Zome, Kyosuke Munokata, and Juzo Sakakura. This trio occupies major roles in both the Future and Despair storylines, as former staff at Hope's Peak during Despair and heads of the Future Foundation during Future. Their story is a tragic one, what isn't in Danganronpa, and yes, a love triangle is involved, but not exactly as you might expect. Munokata was hands down my favorite of the three, serving as something like an unhinged counterpoint to Makoto. Rather than looking to simply stay positive and preserve hope, Munokata instead aims specifically to destroy Despair, stop it in its tracks before it even has a chance to threaten hope. Of course, you could then argue that such a militant strategy is no longer hope at all and is more despairful than anything else, which the show certainly addresses, even if not to a hugely in-depth degree. Ryota Mitarai, the ultimate animator, is another new character deserving of special mention, him too taking part in both halves of the series. Mitarai is in some ways the stereotypical otaku, a thin, tired appearance, difficulties asserting himself, and above all, motivated by his love of anime. But despite his seemingly harmless talent and demeanor, Mitarai hides a frightening guilt over his nebulous involvement with Junko and Oshima, and the events that destroyed the world. His arc too is a sad one, motivated primarily by fear and uncertainty, time and again exploited by others who hold little regard for his own well-being. But his final point of resolution is not an unhappy one, even if it is mildly mundane. As a matter of fact, Danganronpa 3 does quite like playing with its audience, incorporating twists galore. I can't say anything ever reached the heights of Danganronpa 2, where the ending just blew my mind, but the twists are far from bad twists. They can be sad, or painful, or hard to watch, but we wouldn't come to Danganronpa if we expected any different, now would we? An interesting aside to make here is the evolving coloration of the two series. Despair is a story leading into tragedy, so as it continues, its color palette gets darker and darker. Future, on the other hand, is the exact opposite, a story leading out of despair and ultimately into hope, so its colors get slowly but surely brighter and brighter, though it is far more subtle than despair. This sounds like such a simple thing when I lay it out like that, but colors can work wonders at setting an atmosphere. Speaking of colors, the Despair opening is full of colors. I really like this opening as its song and presentation exactly mirror the arc to which it is attached, starting off calm, idyllic, and happy, but with perhaps hints of underlying darkness as illustrated by the imagery of crosshairs and bullet chambers, and before long, Junko shows up to send all the dominoes tumbling down. This opening also makes slight changes to itself over the course of its run, which I am a sucker for, such as the colors growing darker or Hinata disappearing into Izuru. None of the other openings or endings stood out to me as much, but none of them were bad. Future's opening has a nifty death counter to it, which is always nice for reminding you what you're getting yourself into, and Despair's ending is sung by Nagito's voice actress, creating some kind of stark contrast of sadness with the happy imagery of the 77th class. I wish I could sit here and tell you that Danganronpa 3 is unabashedly amazing, a perfect way to close out the series, but alas I cannot. There are some problems that just can't be ignored. Easy one, censorship. Everyone agrees censorship sucks, and there is some censorship here, with the Despair arc in particular. Could have been worse, it's not the end of the world that a character sawing their neck off is blacked out a bit, but if you're gonna go for such dark material, go all the way. I know it's not Lurch's fault, it's the TV network, it's the guidelines, and it'll be fixed in the Blu-rays, but man is it annoying to not be able to make out what exactly is even happening on screen. But no two ways about it, that's a nitpick. Censorship is not going to turn me off from watching a good show. What could turn me off though is poor writing, and poor writing is most prevalent in the Despair and Hope arcs. Like the games before it, Danganronpa 3 glosses over some relatively major things. A character being driven insane happens off screen, for instance. This is in fact relevant to one of my problems with the original Danganronpa. The big revelation of that game was that your memories had been wiped, and that you had all elected to live at Hope's Peak of your own volition due to outside disaster. One thing they never bothered to really explain, though, was how that worked, because no matter what explanation they strung together, it would likely feel lame and disappointing. Well, we got that explanation here, and be careful what you wish for has never been more apt. Some of the other turns of the story, even if believable in context of such a far-fetched series, nonetheless feel hollow. If you can't roll with or at least grudgingly accept one huge plot point, you're gonna have a bad time. That plot point being it just feels silly. It really does. It's also a little bit of a letdown, because you'd hope the Despair arc would be this painful saga of Junko exploiting each of the students' weaknesses and subtly pushing them one by one into despair, but nope! One and done. Looking at the Hope arc specifically, the ending is just too straightforward for what I've come to expect from Danganronpa. Everything pretty much went down exactly as you would expect it to from all the episodes up to that point. There was more or less nothing surprising, and it even made some stuff earlier in the series feel slightly pointless, like the mid-season Ultra Despair Girls interlude or Makoto's eventual entire role in the plot. It also somewhat backpedals on prior developments of the franchise for the sake of nothing, really. I don't see why they had to trample over some of the stuff that they did, other than creating a shortcut to easily pleasing fans. Then, following in the footsteps of Danganronpa 2, we're sadly reaching a point where hope and despair have become empty terms. They've evolved into meaningless buzzwords with little to no actual weight behind them, just placeholders for the good guys and the bad guys. Danganronpa 1 was about hope, but it didn't throw out hope and despair every other conversation. It was a little more natural about it, but now the terms have just become labels, which is slightly disheartening. And that's all I have to say of note, but before we move to the verdict, I should mention one last thing. Although it's hardly a flaw, I must reiterate that this is a sequel to multiple games with no adaptation, and the show makes zero attempt to remind the viewer of events or even fill them in with a recap. Therefore, it is not something I could ever recommend to someone who has only seen the anime, because they will be entirely lost. If you haven't played another episode, on the other hand, and you really don't want to, I'd say at least watch the cutscenes on YouTube. That'll give you enough to fill in the gaps. Regardless, I can respect that they didn't pull their punches, that they wanted to finish the Hope's Peak story this way, and refused to compromise the experience just because newcomers wouldn't get it. Have to give props where props are due. Danganronpa 3 is certainly a conclusion, but it's not a perfect one. While several of the new characters were reasonably strong, its grasp on plot can sometimes be tenuous with explanations that are either tortured or outright poor, and new events that render older ones seemingly irrelevant. Nonetheless, it is still something I would recommend to anyone who has played and enjoyed the prior entries in the series. Not everything goes off without a hitch. Sometimes it's hard to watch in a good way, other times it's hard to watch in a bad way, but at the end of the day, I doubt you would find it a wholly dissatisfying finale. So, after taking everything into account, as well as my own subjective enjoyment on a scale from F to S, I really wanted to give an A. Slot it in with my scores for Danganronpa 1 and 2. Tell you that Danganronpa 3 is great and you should absolutely watch it, but there's just too many problems or disappointments with the writing for me to honestly justify that. It hurts, but I have to give Danganronpa 3 a B. Could have been a lot worse, but definitely could have been better. If you have any interest in Danganronpa 3 and have not yet seen it, although if you are in the proper position to do so, I would think you already have, it is currently available for legal streaming from Funimation, who are also giving it a broadcast dub, which should be wrapping up in a few weeks' time. And that'll do it. Thanks for watching, have a great day, leave any feedback in the comments, subscribe if you want more, and if there's anything you'd like to see reviewed, by all means tell me. See you next time. 息を潜まさまち続けてる